If someone had told me a year ago that the loudest, most infuriatingly alive person I had ever met would become the axis on which my entire world tilted, I would have laughed. A dry, humorless sound, the kind I specialized in. Because my world didn't tilt. It spun, perfectly, predictably, on a routine so rigid it was practically fossilized. I was a creature of habit, of quiet corners and the steady, unobtrusive hum of a life lived behind closed doors. And then there was Julian. He wasn't just a roommate. He was a weather system. He moved into the apartment's second bedroom like a low-pressure front, bringing with him the atmospheric chaos of loud music, the scent of some aggressively masculine shower gel, and a rotating cast of friends who laugh from their bellies, a sound I found both fascinating and deeply alien. My life was a carefully curated library. This was a music festival. We coexisted in the same 800 square feet with the kind of polite, determined ignorance that only strangers forced into intimacy can manage. I knew the rhythm of his heavy footsteps on the hardwood floors. I knew he left his damp towels on the bathroom doorknob. I knew he drank milk directly from the carton. These were not facts born of friendship. They were data points collected from a distance, evidence of a life that brushed up against mine but never truly touched it. He was, from my vantage point, a monolith of uncomplicated confidence. Tall, broad in the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He carried his body with an easy grace that I, with my tendency to fold in on myself, envied with a quiet, burning intensity. He seemed to take up more space in the world than was allotted, not just physically, but energetically. When Julian was home, the very air in the apartment felt thicker, charged with his presence. I, on the other hand, practiced a kind of social invisibility. My job as a freelance transcriptionist allowed me to exist primarily within the four walls of my room, my headphones a permanent fixture, sealing me away from the world. My routine was my armor. Wake at 6. Coffee black. Work until noon. A simple lunch, eaten alone at my desk. Work until 5. Dinner, usually something microwaved, followed by an evening of reading. The silence of my room was a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the vibrant, often chaotic life happening just on the other side of my door. The distance between us was a chasm of unspoken rules and separate lives. We communicated through terse, sticky notes left on the refrigerator. Your turn to buy toilet paper. Rent is due Friday. We were two ghosts haunting the same house, aware of each other's presence only through the minor disturbances we left in our wake. A dirty dish in the sink. The sound of a key in the lock. I observed him the way an astronomer observes a distant, fiery star, with a mixture of awe and the certain knowledge that getting any closer would result in immediate incineration. I watched him through the crack of my bedroom door as he'd talk on the phone, pacing the length of our small living room. He didn't just talk. He gestured, he moved, he inhabited his words. I saw the easy camaraderie he shared with his friends, the way he'd sling an arm over a shoulder, the unrestrained laughter. He was a native in a world where I was a tourist, and I didn't even speak the language. This carefully constructed barrier, this polite and silent truce, held for 6 months. 6 months of my quiet, predictable orbit around his blazing sun. I had convinced myself this was enough. This was safe. The longing I felt was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my days, a secret I kept even for myself. A longing for what? I wasn't sure. For a life less gray. For a noise that wasn't just the static in my own head. For the kind of warmth that I imagined radiated from him like heat from asphalt in the summer. It was a foolish, pointless ache, and I was an expert at ignoring it. Until the night the lights went out. It began as a flicker, a stutter in the steady glow of my desk lamp. I barely registered it, lost in the drone of the audio file I was transcribing. Then came a second flicker, longer this time, and the building's ancient air conditioning unit groaned to a halt. The sudden, profound silence was what truly alerted me. It was a heavy, unfamiliar quiet, entirely different from the curated silence of my room. This was a dead quiet, an absence, and then darkness, complete and total. My monitor went black, My lamp died, and the city's endless, ambient hum vanished. I was plunged into a blackness so absolute it felt physical, like being wrapped in velvet. My heart gave a startled little leap against my ribs. A frantic trapped bird. I sat frozen for a long moment, my fingers still hovering over the silent keyboard. My first thought was practical, a blown fuse. My second was a prickle of anxiety. The fuse box was in the hall closet, a space I avoided, a neutral territory that felt more his than mine. Then I heard it, a thud from the living room, followed by a low curse. Julian. He was home. Of course he was home. It was a Friday night, the one night he usually wasn't. A disruption in his routine, and now a disruption in mine. The universe, it seemed, had a penchant for irony. Another sound, the scrape of a chair. Now, you hear. His voice, stripped of the usual background noise of television or music, sounded different. Louder. Closer. It sliced through the oppressive silence and landed somewhere in the base of my spine. I realized I was holding my breath. Yeah, I called back, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. I'm here. The creak of floorboards told me he was moving. I fumbled for my phone on the desk, its sudden screen a blinding rectangle of light in the ink-black room. I clicked on its flashlight, the narrow beam cutting a shaky path across my cluttered desk and over to the door. I opened it. Forced proximity. The two words echoed in my head with the clang of a prison door. For the first time in 6 months, we were about to be in a room together with no escape, no headphones, no separate tasks to hide behind. Just us in the suffocating dark. Julian stood in the middle of the living room, a dark, broad silhouette against the faint, bruised purple of the city skyline, visible through the window. He was just a shape, a presence. He hadn't turned on his own phone's light yet. "The whole block is out," he said. His voice was just a voice now, not a sound I had to filter through a wall. Looked out the window. It's the whole neighborhood. This was more than a blown fuse. This was an event. Aprupe, bona fide disruption. The carefully constructed walls of my routine were crumbling. My stomach was full of bees of frantic, buzzing panic. I kept my phone's beam pointed at the floor, a circle of safety in a world that had suddenly lost its edges. "I have candles," I heard myself say, the words emerging without conscious thought. An offering, a desperate bid to control the situation, to bring some semblance of order to the chaos. Yeah. A hint of surprise in his tone. The quiet guy is prepared for the apocalypse. Should have figured there was no malice in it, maybe even a sliver of humor, but it still made my skin prickle. The quiet guy. It was how he saw me. A two-dimensional character sketch. It was, to be fair, all I had ever shown him. I retreated to my room, the beam of light my guide, and returned with a handful of emergency candles and a lighter. I set them on the coffee table, the neutral ground between his side of the sofa and mine. My hands were shaking as I lit the first wick. The flames sputtered to life, a tiny, defiant sun in our shared darkness. It threw our shadows, huge and distorted, against the walls. Julian sat down on the couch. The springs groaned under his weight. I sat on the armchair opposite, a piece of furniture I had never used, my body perched on the edge of the cushion, ready for flight. We sat in silence for a while, watching the candle flames dance. The silence was different now. It wasn't the empty, avoidant silence of our usual coexistence. It was a shared silence, thick with the things we'd never said. It was a physical weight. I found myself watching him in the flickering light. For the first time, he wasn't a figure seen from a distance or through a crack in a door. He was just a few feet away. The candlelight carved sharp angles into his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the bridge of his nose. It softened the edges of his usual confidence, making him look younger, more uncertain. I noticed things I hadn't before. A thin, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. The calloused, capable look of his hands as they rested on his knees. He wasn't a monolith. He was just a person sitting in the dark. He caught me looking. I quickly dropped my gaze to the floor, my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the candles. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is weird, yeah," I agreed, my eyes fixed on a particularly interesting dust bunny under the coffee table. No Wi-Fi. No TV. No lights. He let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't think I know what to do with myself, this was it. A crack in the facade. The first sign of a vulnerability I never would have suspected. The all-powerful Julian, master of his social universe, was grounded. Stripped of his usual distractions, he was bored, maybe even a little lost. I have a deck of cards, I offered quietly, the words feeling clumsy and oversized in my mouth. He looked up, a real smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. Seriously? You have apocalypse cards, too? They're just cards, I mumbled, feeling the need to defend myself. Go get 'em, he said, and there was a genuine warmth in his voice that caught me off guard. We played gin rummy on the floor by candlelight. The game was a flimsy pretense, a structure to contain the sprawling awkwardness between us. But it worked. It gave us something to do with our hands, a place to focus our eyes. We started to talk, not about anything important. We talked about bad movies, the weird smell in the building's lobby, the questionable quality of the local pizza place. It was startlingly easy, without the pressure of his friends or the escape of our separate rooms. The chasm between us began to feel less like a chasm and more like a small gap we could, if we wanted, step across. He told me he was supposed to be on a camping trip that weekend, but his friend had bailed at the last minute. So instead of sitting in the woods in the dark, he said with a wry grin, I'm sitting in my living room in the dark. Araluprada, iata camping, ikumfasha. Bugs. And sleeping on the ground, he laughed, a real, deep laugh this time. The sound didn't feel alien anymore. It felt nice. It warmed the small, dark space between us. You're missing out, man. Nothing like it. The stars, you know. I didn't know. The only stars I ever saw were the faint, hazy smudges visible through the city's light pollution. Hours passed. The candles burned lower, dripping pools of wax onto the table. The city outside remained a black hole, silent and still. We had moved from cards to just talking, Julian leaning back against the couch, me still in the armchair, though I'd settled back into it, no longer poised for escape. He was telling me a story about a disastrous fishing trip from his childhood. He was animated, using his hands, his voice rising and falling with the narrative. I was completely captivated. I was seeing the person his friends saw, the storyteller, the easygoing, funny guy. And I realized with a jolt that the intimidating confidence I'd always observed was just energy, a life force that was too big to be contained. He gestured widely to emphasize a point about the size of fish that got away, and the back of his hand brushed against my knee. It was nothing, an accident, a flicker of contact in the dark. But to me, it was a lightning strike, a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity that shot straight from my knee up my spine and exploded in my chest. My breath hitched. The air crackled. The entire world narrowed to that single, fleeting point of contact. My skin burned where he had touched it. A brand. He pulled his hand back instantly, as if he'd been burned too. Sorry, he mumbled, his story faltering. It's fine, I said, my voice a strangled whisper. But it wasn't fine. The spell of our easy conversation was broken. The space between us was suddenly charged again, but this time it wasn't with awkwardness. It was with something else. Something heavy and humming and dangerous. I couldn't look at him. I could feel his eyes on me in the dark. The power dynamic had shifted. That accidental touch, that tiny, insignificant event, had leveled the playing field. He had touched me, and I hadn't flinched away, and he had apologized. He had seen my reaction, the sharp intake of breath, the way I froze. He knew, or maybe he didn't. Maybe my anxiety was just writing a novel where there was only a single word. But the air was different. I was no longer just a quiet observer. I was in the scene, a participant, and it was terrifying. We should probably get some sleep, I said finally, desperate to break the tension, to retreat to the safety of my room. Yeah, he agreed, but he didn't move. Neither did I. We were frozen in the candlelight, caught in the gravity of that unspoken moment. The remaining beer from the fridge was warm, but we drank it anyway. The power had been out for hours now, and the summer heat was beginning to press in, making the apartment stuffy. We'd abandoned the card game, and the conversation had dwindled back into a shared, watchful silence. But it was a different silence than before. The accidental touch had changed its texture. It was no longer empty. It was full. It was a hell breath. Julian had retrieved the six-pack from the dying refrigerator. Might as well, he'd said with a shrug, and I hadn't protested. The alcohol felt like a necessary buffer, a lubricant for the rusted gears of our interaction. He was on his third beer, and I was nursing my first. I wasn't much of a drinker. I liked the control of a clear head. But tonight, control felt like a distant country I no longer had a passport for. He was sitting on the floor now, his back against the sofa, his long legs stretched out, almost reaching my armchair. The candlelight threw his shadow, huge and wavering, onto the wall behind him. It made him look like a giant, a figure from some old myth. But his posture was loose, relaxed. The alcohol had softened him further, sanding down the remaining sharp edges. "You're always in your room," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. It wasn't an accusation. It was just an observation, a fact stated in the dark. I took a slow sip of my beer. I work from home. It was the standard, easy answer. The one that kept people from asking more questions. Yeah, but always he tilted the bottle back, finishing it. He set the empty bottle down on the floor with a soft clink. "I hear your keyboard sometimes. Late at night. Click, click, click." Like a little machine, my heart did a slow, painful somersault. He listened. He heard me. I had imagined myself as a ghost in the apartment, but he had been aware of me, of my habits, of the sound of my life. The thought was both terrifying and strangely thrilling. "It's just work," I said, my voice barely audible. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing. He reached for another beer. "You know," he started, his voice even lower now, laced with a vulnerability that alcohol sometimes unlocks. "People think I've got it all figured out." I said nothing. I just listened. This felt like a sacred space, a confessional booth materialized in our darkened living room. All my friends, they think I'm a guy with a plan. The one who's always up for anything, always got a joke. He shook his head, a small, dark movement. It's exhausting, there it was. The confession, not of love, not of desire, but of something far more intimate. A confession of weakness. The strong, silent type was telling me his strength was a performance. My perception of him, built over 6 months of distant observation, shattered into a million pieces. "It's just loud," he continued, struggling for the words. "My life is so loud all the time. The music, the parties, everyone talking. Sometimes I just want to turn the volume down. You know." He looked at me then, his eyes searching for mine in the gloom. "You're good at that. The volume is always down with you." My stomach twisted into a knot of 100 competing emotions. He saw my solitude not as a failing, but as a skill, a kind of peace he craved. The idea was so foreign, so antithetical to everything I believed about myself that I couldn't process it. I started then stopped. What could I say? That my silence wasn't peace, it was fear? That my quiet was a fortress I'd built to keep the world out, because I was terrified of what would happen if I ever let it in? He didn't wait for me to finish. He started to move. He unfolded himself from the floor and crawled the short distance across the rug that separated us. It was a slow, deliberate movement. My pulse hammered in my throat, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence. He stopped when his knees were inches from my feet. He was looking up at me from the floor, and the shift in perspective was dizzying. The giant was kneeling. He placed his hands on the arms of my chair, trapping me. The warmth of his body radiated across the small space between us. I could smell the beer on his breath, mixed with that clean, masculine scent of his soap. "Leo," he said, and my name on his lips was a revelation. He rarely used it. It sounded foreign, precious. My entire body was rigid, a statue carved from pure anxiety. This is it. This is the point of no return. My mind was screaming at me to run, to push him away, to retreat to the safety of my room and bolt the door. But my body wouldn't obey. I was pinned by his proximity, by the unexpected, terrifying hope that was blooming in my chest like a nightshade flower. beautiful and poisonous. He leaned in closer. The candle flames flickered, dancing in his dark eyes. He whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I'm so tired of being loud. And then he closed the small distance between us. His lips were soft, softer than I could have ever imagined. There was a moment of hesitation, a gentle, questioning pressure. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was slow. It was uncertain. It was a question asked in a language my body understood far better than my mind. My mind went completely, blessedly blank. For the first time in what felt like my entire life, the relentless monologue in my head fell silent. There were no what-ifs, no worst-case scenarios. There was only the surprising softness of his mouth, the rough scrape of his stubble against my skin, the heat of his hands on the arms of the chair. Instinct took over. I leaned into him, my hand coming up to rest on his shoulder. I could feel the solid muscle beneath his t-shirt. He responded to my touch, his mouth growing a little more confident, a little more insistent. One of his hands left the armchair and came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. The gesture was so tender, so impossibly gentle. It broke something open inside of me. A dam of loneliness I hadn't even known was there burst, and all the longing I had so carefully suppressed came rushing out. This was what I had been missing. Not the parties, not the noise. This, the warmth of another person. The silent communication of touch. The feeling of being not just seen, but wanted. When he finally pulled away, it was only by an inch. Our faces were still close, our breath mingling in the warm air. His eyes were dark and serious in the candlelight. Sorry, he breathed, the word a stark contrast to the confidence of his actions. Drunk. This is don't. I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. Don't be sorry. A flicker of something. Relief? Surprise? Passed over his face. He leaned his forehead against mine, and we just stayed there for a long moment, breathing each other in, the world reduced to the flickering candlelight and the space of a single breath. The turning point. The moment the old world ended and a new, terrifying, beautiful one began. I woke to the aggressive, jarring hum of the refrigerator. My first thought was, light? Sunlight was streaming through the living room window, bright and unforgiving. My second thought was noise. The sounds of the city had returned, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic. The power was back on. The blackout was over. My third thought, which crashed into me with the force of physical blow, was, I am alone. I was on the armchair, a stiff crick in my neck, a blanket I didn't remember draped over me. The living room was bathed in the harsh light of morning, and it looked pathetic. The coffee table was a mess of empty beer bottles and puddles of hardened candle wax. It looked like the aftermath of a party, but it was just the debris of two people. Julian was gone. His bedroom door was closed. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the appliances. The thick, intimate atmosphere of the night before had evaporated with the darkness. The morning had brought with it a cruel clarity. My stomach plummeted, a stone dropping into a deep, cold well. A spiral of pure, uncut panic began to churn within me. It was the beer. That had to be it. He was drunk. He'd said himself. He was lonely because his friends had bailed on him, the power was out, and he was bored. I was just there, a convenient distraction, an experiment, a mistake. The memories of the night replayed in my head, but now they were tainted, twisted by the harsh light of day. His confession of loneliness wasn't a moment of genuine vulnerability. It was a drunk person rambling. The kiss wasn't a hesitant, beautiful question. It was a clumsy, alcohol-fueled impulse. My own response horrified me. The way I had leaned into him, the way I had touched him, the desperate, whispered, "Don't be sorry." I felt a wave of shame so powerful it made me physically nauseous. I had been so easy, so pathetically grateful for a scrap of attention that I had completely misread everything. He was probably in his room right now, awake and mortified, regretting every second of it, trying to figure out how he was going to face the weird, quiet roommate he had inexplicably kissed during a blackout. The silence from his room was a judgment. It was the sound of regret, The sound of a wall being rebuilt, thicker and higher than before. My carefully ordered world, which had been so gloriously tilted off its axis last night, had not just righted itself. It had crashed. The quiet I had once found peaceful now felt like a punishment. My solitude, once a comfort, was now just loneliness, stark and echoing. The apartment felt huge and empty. The absence of him was a physical presence, a ghost sitting on the sofa, watching me with pity. I had to get out. I couldn't be here when he finally emerged from his room. I couldn't face the awkward silence, the forced, polite conversation, the apology I knew was coming. The thought of him saying, "Look, man, about last night," made my throat close up. I scrambled up from the chair, my limbs stiff and clumsy. I gathered the empty bottles with frantic, jerky movements, shoving them into the recycling bin with more force than necessary. I scraped the hardened wax off the table, my fingernails digging into the wood. I was trying to erase the evidence, to pretend it never happened. But I couldn't erase the memory of his lips. I couldn't scrub the phantom sensation of his hand in my hair. I fled to my room, the one place that had always been my sanctuary. But it didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like a cage. I closed the door, the click of the latch sounding like a death sentence. I sank onto my bed, my heart a frantic, panicked drum against my ribs. The morning after, it was a crucible, burning away the beautiful illusions of the night and leaving only the harsh, ugly ash of reality. I had let him in. I had opened the door to my fortress, just a crack, and he had strolled in, set off a bomb, and then left, leaving me to deal with the wreckage. And the worst part, the absolute most painful part, was the tiny, stupid, resilient flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. The part of me that whispered, "But what if it wasn't a mistake?" It was that hope that was going to destroy me. An hour passed. 2 hours. I stayed in my room, a prisoner of my own anxiety. I heard his door open. My entire body went rigid. I heard his footsteps in the hall, the sound of the bathroom door closing, the shower turning on. He was here. He hadn't just packed a bag and left forever. The sound of the water was a kind of torture. I imagined him in there, washing away the memory of me, of my touch, of the entire night. When he was done, he would come to my door. He would knock, and the world would end. The shower shut off. The silence that followed was somehow louder, more terrifying. I waited. Every second stretched into an eternity. I counted my own heartbeats, a frantic, uneven rhythm. The knock never came. Instead, I heard the front door open and close. He had left. He had showered and left without a word. He couldn't even stand to be in the same apartment with me long enough to have a cup of coffee. The silence he left behind was definitive. It was an answer. It was a rejection so profound it felt like it had been carved into my bones. The rest of the day was a blur of misery. I tried to work, but the words on the screen were just meaningless symbols. The voice in my headphones was just noise. My focus was gone, shattered. My sanctuary had been breached, and my armor was useless. I was just a raw nerve ending, exposed and aching. My former solitude, the one I had cultivated so carefully, had returned. But it was tainted now. It was no longer a state of being. It was an absence. The apartment wasn't quiet. It was empty. It was missing the sound of his footsteps, his music, his voice. I had gotten a taste of what it was like to share a space, to connect with the person on the other side of the wall, and now the silence was unbearable. He didn't come home that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. The ghost of him was everywhere. I saw him kneeling on the floor, his eyes dark in the candlelight. I felt the ghost of his lips on mine. Each memory was a fresh turn of the knife. I had been a fool, a lonely, hopeful fool, and I had learned my lesson. I would rebuild my walls. I would reinforce my fortress. I would never, ever make myself that vulnerable again. The next day was a Sunday, a gray, drizzling, miserable day that perfectly matched my mood. I forced myself through my routine, coffee, shower, work, clinging to the familiar rituals like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. It was a hollow performance. The rhythm was there, but the peace it used to bring was gone. I was making lunch, mechanically assembling a sandwich I had no appetite for, when I heard the key in the front door. My blood ran cold. My hands froze over the counter. I couldn't breathe. He was back. The door opened, and Julian stepped inside. He looked terrible. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd had on yesterday. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. He looked wrecked. He saw me standing in the kitchen, and he stopped dead in the doorway. We stared at each other across the length of the living room. The space between us felt like miles. The silence was a humming, high-voltage wire. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might actually break through my ribs. My mind was a whirlwind of panic. Say something. Don't say anything. Run. Stay. He was the one who broke the silence. He closed the door softly behind him and took a tentative step into the room. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, at the couch, at the window, anywhere but at me. "Hey," he said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. "Hey," I managed to reply. The word was a dry little crumb in my throat. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture of pure anxiety. It was so jarring to see him like this, him, the king of confidence, looking as lost and terrified as I felt. He was displaying his own vulnerability, his own regret, and it wasn't the kind of regret I had imagined. He didn't look like a guy who was embarrassed by a drunken mistake. He looked like a man who was terrified he had broken something precious. "Can we?" he started, then stopped. He took a deep breath. "Can we talk?" This was it, the clarifying conversation. The confrontation I had both dreaded and, if I was being honest with myself, desperately hoped for. I nodded, unable to speak. I gestured numbly toward the couch. He sat on one end. I sat on the other, as far apart as we could possibly get. The distance felt safe and agonizing. He stared at his hands, which were clasped tightly between his knees. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, "for just leaving. That was a coward's move. It was not the apology I'd been expecting." My brain struggled to catch up. "I freaked out," he admitted, finally looking at me. His eyes were filled with a raw, miserable honesty. "I woke up, and the power was on, and it was morning, and everything was real, and it scared the hell out of me. My carefully constructed narrative of the drunken mistake began to crumble." "Scared?" I echoed, the word feeling foreign. "Yeah, scared." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Me? Scared? Funny, right? But that..." He gestured vaguely at the space between us, the space where the kiss had happened. "That wasn't. I wasn't just drunk, Leo. The beer made me brave enough to do it, maybe. But I wasn't just drunk. My heart, which had been a cold, dead stone in my chest, gave a faint, hopeful flutter. I've been watching you," he confessed, his gaze dropping back to his hands. "For months. You're in your own little world, and you seem so content, so quiet. And I'm out here making all this noise, and none of it means anything. It's just noise. And then I look at you, and you're just calm. And I wanted some of that. I wanted to know what it was like inside your world." He was describing me as if I were some kind of Zen master and not a bundle of anxieties held together by routine and caffeine. The disconnect was staggering. He saw peace where I felt fear. He saw contentment where I felt loneliness. "It's not calm," I said, the words spilling out of me before I could stop them. In my head, "It's not calm at all. It's just as loud as your life. It's just, on the inside." It was the most honest thing I had ever said to him, to anyone. He looked up at me, his expression shifting into something soft, something understanding. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'm starting to think maybe everyone's life is loud." We sat in that new understanding for a moment. The acknowledgement that this new emotional territory was frightening, but desired. We were two people who had built completely different kinds of fortresses, and for one night, we had lowered our drawbridges. And now we were standing in the rubble, trying to figure out if we could build something new together. "I like you, Leo," he said, the words direct and simple and utterly terrifying. "And it scares me, because I don't know how to do this. I only know how to be loud. I don't know how to be quiet. With someone, I only know how to be quiet," I whispered back. "I don't know how to be." With someone, a small, sad smile touched his lips. "Well, we're a hell of a pair then," He took a breath, and then he did something that took all the air from my lungs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it, his thumb moving over the screen. Then he held it out for me to see. He was in the App Store, his finger hovering over the delete button on a popular dating app. He held my gaze, his own eyes deadly serious. And he pressed delete. The app icon vanished. It was a symbolic gesture, but it was more powerful than any poem, more binding than any promise. It was a tangible act of commitment. It was him, in his own way, saying, "I'm done with the noise. I want to try learning the quiet. With you." He then navigated to his photos and showed me a picture. It was a small, rustic-looking cabin by a lake, surrounded by pine trees. "My family's place," he said. "It's quiet there. Really quiet. I go there when I need to." Turn the volume down. He locked the phone and put it away. "I'd like to take you there sometime, a future." He was offering me a promise of a future, of quiet places, of together. The last of my walls crumbled into dust. The fear was still there, a faint tremor deep inside me. But for the first time, it was overshadowed by something else. Hope. A real, brilliant, terrifying hope. A move then. I slid across the couch, closing the distance between us. And I took his hand. His fingers, calloused and warm, closed around mine. It felt like coming home. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. For a split second, the old panic flared. The morning after. But then I opened my eyes. I wasn't in my own bed. I was in Julian's. The sheets were a tangled mess around us, and sunlight was filtering through his blinds. His arm was draped possessively over my waist, and his slow, steady breathing was a warm puff against the back of my neck. He was still here. We were still here. The coffee smell was coming from the kitchen. I slipped out of his hold as gently as I could, pulling on a t-shirt and padding out of the room. He was at the stove, shirtless, wearing a pair of sweatpants, his back to me. He was humming softly to himself as he poured hot water into a French press. A scene of such simple, profound domesticity, it almost made my heart ache. This was the kind of quiet he had talked about, the comfortable, shared silence of a morning routine. He must have heard me, because he turned around, a mug in his hand. He smiled when he saw me, a slow, easy smile that was just for me. It wasn't the loud, performative grin he gave his friends. It was soft and genuine, and it made my stomach do a slow, happy flip. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. He held the mug out to me. "I figured you took it black," he remembered, from some conversation we'd had, or maybe just from observing me, he knew. The smallness of the detail, the casual intimacy of it, was everything. "Thanks," I said, my fingers brushing against his as I took the mug. This time, the touch wasn't a lightning strike. It was just warmth, a pleasant, steady current. We didn't talk much. We stood in the kitchen, sipping our coffee, the morning light painting stripes across the floor. But the silence wasn't empty or awkward. It was comfortable, full. We were simply existing in the same space, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The old me, the one who lived in a fortress of solitude, would have found this terrifying. The intrusion, the disruption of routine. But standing here, in the quiet warmth of the kitchen with him, I didn't feel fear. I felt peace. The very thing he thought I already had, I was only just now finding. With him. Later, we sat on the couch, the same couch where we'd sat so far apart just the day before. Now I was leaned against his side, his arm around my shoulders, as we watched some mindless show on TV. It was simple. It was easy. The push and pull was over. The cycle of tension and retreat had been broken. This was the new beginning. I thought back to the man I was just a few days ago, the person who observed life from behind a closed door. My world was so small then, so gray and predictable. I had mistaken safety for happiness. I had built a life that was designed to prevent any possibility of getting hurt, but in doing so, I had also eliminated any possibility of real joy. Julian was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the disruption, the loud, chaotic weather system that had torn through my quiet life. He had dismantled my routines and broken down my walls. And in the wreckage, we were building something new, something better, something shared. He shifted beside me, pulling me a little closer. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head. It was a simple, thoughtless gesture of affection, and it meant more to me than any grand declaration ever could. I realized my life wasn't about being quiet or loud. It was about finding the person you could be both with. The person who made your quiet feel peaceful instead of lonely, and whose noise sounded like music instead of chaos. Looking back, I didn't come to this apartment looking for love. I came here looking for a cheap room with a month-to-month lease. But sometimes, life has other plans. Sometimes, the most unexpected person, the one who seems like your polar opposite, is the only one who can truly see you. And sometimes, it takes a citywide blackout to finally let you see them, too. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed the course of your life? A single event or a single person that turned everything upside down in the best possible way? Let me know your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing for more stories about finding connection in the most unexpected places.